The scream that tore through the Silver Creek trading post wasn't what caught Ezra Blackwood's attention that sweltering afternoon in July of 1873, but rather the silence that followed when the heavy oak door slammed shut behind an angry cowhand. Every person in that cramped Montana establishment had turned toward the commotion, except for one woman who stood frozen near the corner, her entire body rigid as stone, eyes squeezed shut, hands trembling so violently that the bolt of calico fabric she had been examining slipped from her fingers and unraveled across the dusty floorboards. Ezra had been in Silver Creek for 3 days, the longest stretch he had spent in civilization in nearly 8 months. The mountain man had come down from his trap lines in the Bitterroot Range to trade his winter's worth of pelts, restock his supplies, and perhaps find himself a decent meal that did not involve rabbit or venison. At 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and a beard he kept trimmed close to his jaw, Ezra cut an imposing figure even among the rough men who populated the Montana frontier. His hands were scarred from years of working trap lines, splitting wood, and surviving winters that would have killed lesser men. Those same hands now hung loose at his sides as he watched the woman in the corner with an intensity that surprised even himself. She was small, perhaps 5 feet 3 at most, with copper-colored hair pulled back in a simple bun that had started to come loose. Her dress was plain gray cotton, mended in several places, and hung on her frame in a way that suggested she had lost weight recently. But it was her face that held Ezra's attention. Even from across the room, he could see the terror written there, could see the way her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, could see the stark whiteness of her knuckles as she gripped the edge of a display table. The trading post owner, a portly man named Chester Holbrook, hurried over to the woman. "Miss Caroline, are you quite all right? That damned fool Thompson did not watch where he was going." The woman, Caroline, opened her eyes slowly. She nodded but said nothing. Her lips moved as though she might speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she bent down and began gathering up the fallen fabric with movements that struck Ezra as almost mechanical, as though she were forcing her body to obey commands it did not want to follow. "Let me help you with that," Chester said, kneeling beside her. "No." The word came out sharp and louder than Caroline seemed to have intended. She flinched at her own voice. "I apologize. I can manage." Chester straightened, looking uncomfortable. "Of course. Take your time, Miss Caroline. No rush at all." Ezra completed his own transaction, trading his pelts for coin and loading his supplies into the wagon he had borrowed from the livery. But he found himself unable to leave. Instead, he lingered near the hitching post, checking his horse's harnesses with more care than necessary, adjusting ropes that did not need adjusting. He told himself he was being foolish, that whatever trouble that woman carried was none of his concern. He had learned long ago that civilization and its complications were things best avoided. The mountains were simple, honest. A man knew where he stood with a bear or a blizzard. People were far more dangerous. But when Caroline finally emerged from the trading post, carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, Ezra found his feet moving of their own accord. She had started down the wooden sidewalk when a gust of wind caught the door of the saloon next door, slamming it shut with a bang that echoed down the street. Caroline dropped her bundle and stumbled backward, colliding with the wall of the building behind her. Her hands flew up as though to ward off a blow, and a small, choked sound escaped her throat. Ezra was beside her in 3 long strides. "Ma'am," he said quietly, keeping his voice low and even. He had used this same tone to calm spooked horses and wounded animals. "You are safe. It was only the wind." Caroline's eyes snapped to his face, wide and dark as a doe's. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her breathing ragged. Then, slowly, awareness seemed to return. She lowered her hands and looked around as though surprised to find herself pressed against the wall of the mercantile. "I know that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it was the wind." Ezra bent and retrieved her fallen package, noting the way she tracked his movements, the way she kept herself angled so that her back was never fully to him. He held out the bundle, careful not to make any sudden moves. "You dropped this." She took it from him, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you." "Are you staying in town?" Ezra asked. Caroline hesitated, and he could see the calculation in her eyes, the weighing of whether to answer truthfully or to lie. Finally, she said, "I have a room at the boarding house. That is on Maple Street, is it not?" "Yes. I will walk with you." "That is not necessary." The words came quickly, almost reflexively. "Perhaps not," Ezra agreed, "but I'm heading that direction myself." This was a lie, but a harmless one. Ezra had no particular destination in mind beyond the livery, which was in the opposite direction. But something in this woman's bearing, in the haunted shadows beneath her eyes, in the way she held herself as though expecting violence from every quarter, called to something deep in his chest. He recognized trauma when he saw it. He had worn it himself once, years ago. Caroline studied him for a long moment. Ezra stood still under her scrutiny, letting her look her fill. He knew what she would see. A large, rough-looking man in buckskin trousers and a worn cotton shirt, dusty from travel, bristling with the kind of barely contained strength that came from a life of hard physical labor. He probably should have been more frightening than reassuring, but perhaps that same hardness also suggested competence, capability, protection. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." They walked in silence down the main street of Silver Creek. The town was small, even by Montana Territory standards, boasting perhaps 300 permanent residents, and however many drifters, miners, and cowboys happened to be passing through at any given time. The buildings were mostly wood frame construction, weathered gray by the harsh mountain winters and painted occasionally with whitewash that never quite covered the grain beneath. The street itself was hard-packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it did not. Ezra matched his pace to Caroline's shorter stride, acutely aware of the space between them. She walked with her shoulders slightly hunched, her bundle held tight, her eyes constantly scanning the street ahead. When they passed the blacksmith shop, the sound of hammer-striking anvil made her jump, though she recovered quickly. "How long have you been in Silver Creek?" Ezra asked, more to distract her than out of genuine curiosity. 2 weeks, Caroline replied. Then, as though realizing how curt that sounded, she added, "I came from Denver." Denver was nearly 500 miles to the south. That was no casual journey for a woman alone. "That is quite a distance," Ezra observed. "Yes." She offered no further explanation, and Ezra did not press. They reached the boarding house, a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and shutters that had once been painted green. Mrs. Martha Pemberton ran the establishment with an iron hand and a surprisingly kind heart, charging fair rates and asking few questions of her tenants. Ezra knew Martha slightly, having stayed there himself on previous visits to town. Carolyn stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Thank you for walking with me, Mr. Blackwood, Ezra Blackwood." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." She climbed 2 steps, then paused and looked back at him. "I apologize for my behavior earlier. I'm not usually so—" She trailed off, seemingly unable to find the right word. "No apology necessary," Ezra said. "We all carry our scars, Miss Caroline. Some are just more visible than others." Something flickered in her eyes at that, something that might have been understanding or gratitude or simple relief at not having to explain herself. She nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the boarding house. Ezra stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, watching the door close gently behind her. Then he shook his head at his own foolishness and headed back toward the center of town. He had supplies to organize and a long journey back to his cabin to prepare for. This woman and her troubles were not his concern. But that night, lying on the narrow bed in his room at the hotel, Ezra found his thoughts returning to Caroline's face, to the fear in her eyes, to the way her entire body had recoiled from the sound of a slamming door. He had seen men return from war wearing that same expression, jumping at loud noises, unable to settle, unable to rest. Whatever had happened to Caroline had left wounds that went far deeper than the skin. The next morning, Ezra found himself walking past the boarding house on his way to nowhere in particular. He told himself he was simply exploring the town, but he knew the truth was more complicated than that. He had always been drawn to damaged things, to injured animals and lost causes. It was one of the reasons he preferred the mountains. Up there, he could not be tempted to involve himself in problems that were not his to solve. He saw Caroline leaving the boarding house, carrying a woven basket over one arm. She wore the same gray dress as the day before, and her hair was once again pulled back in a simple bun. She walked with purpose, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, clearly trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Ezra followed at a distance, telling himself he was merely ensuring she reached her destination safely. She walked to the church at the edge of town, a small white building with a modest steeple. The door stood open, and Caroline disappeared inside. Curious now, Ezra crossed the street and approached the church. Through the open door, he could see Caroline kneeling in front of the altar, not in prayer, but in work. She was scrubbing the floor with a brush, her movements methodical and thorough. The basket beside her contained cleaning supplies. Reverend Thomas Walsh emerged from a side room, a kindly man in his 50s with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He spotted Ezra in the doorway and came over, smiling. "Mr. Blackwood, is it not? You were here for services last Sunday." Ezra had attended, mostly because there was little else to do on a Sunday morning in Silver Creek, and Mrs. Martha had invited him. "Yes, Reverend? What can I do for you today?" Ezra nodded toward Caroline. "I was curious about Miss Caroline. She seems to be working." The Reverend's expression grew more somber. "Ah, yes, poor girl. She came to me 2 weeks ago looking for any kind of honest work. I do not have much to offer, but I pay her what I can to help maintain the church. She's a hard worker, never complains, always punctual." "Where did she come from?" Reverend Walsh hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "She has not shared many details, and I have not pressed her. But I gather she left a difficult situation. She had bruises when she first arrived, Mr. Blackwood. Old ones, fading, but visible nonetheless. And she jumps at every sudden sound, every unexpected movement." He paused, looking at Ezra with sharp eyes that saw more than most people gave him credit for. "Why do you ask?" "I do not rightly know," Ezra admitted. "I suppose I am concerned." "That speaks well of you." The Reverend clasped his hands behind his back. "She could use a friend, I think. Someone who does not demand explanations or try to fix things that cannot be easily mended. Someone patient." Ezra considered this. Patience he had in abundance. The mountains had taught him that. "I'm only in town for a few more days." "Then perhaps make those days count." Over the following days, Ezra found himself increasingly aware of Caroline's presence in the small town. He learned her routine through simple observation. She cleaned the church 3 days a week, took in mending and sewing for Mrs. Pemberton's other boarders, and occasionally helped at the general store when Chester Holbrook needed an extra pair of hands for inventory. She kept to herself, speaking to others only when necessary, and she always moved through town during the busiest parts of the day, when the streets were crowded enough that she could blend in, but not so empty that she might find herself alone. Ezra also noticed that he was not the only one who had observed Caroline's affliction. The people of Silver Creek were, for the most part, kind. They had noticed how she flinched at sudden noises, how she startled at raised voices, how she seemed to fold in on herself whenever a man approached too quickly or stood too close. And they had, in their own small ways, begun to accommodate her. Chester Holbrook made a point of holding the door of his trading post when Caroline entered or exited, easing it shut with exaggerated care. The blacksmith, a burly Scotsman named Duncan MacLeod, stopped his hammering whenever she passed his shop, waiting until she was well down the street before resuming his work. Even the cowboys and miners, men not known for their delicacy, seemed to moderate their behavior in her presence, keeping their voices lower, their movements less abrupt. But it was Ezra who found himself most attuned to her needs, most aware of her presence. He began timing his own movements around town to intersect with hers, never intrusively, never obviously, but always nearby. When she walked to the church, he happened to be crossing the street. When she carried a heavy basket of laundry for Mrs. Pemberton, he appeared to offer assistance, which she always declined, but seemed grateful for nonetheless. On his 5th day in Silver Creek, Ezra was sitting on the bench outside the hotel when Caroline emerged from the general store, her arms laden with packages. The door swung shut behind her, and though Chester had clearly tried to close it gently, the wind caught it at the last moment, sending it crashing into the frame with a resounding bang. Caroline froze, every muscle in her body going rigid. The packages began to slip from her arms. Ezra was on his feet and moving before conscious thought could intervene. He reached her just as the first package hit the ground, steadying her with a hand on her elbow while simultaneously catching 2 falling parcels with his other arm. "I have you," he said quietly. "You're safe." Caroline's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and Ezra recognized the signs of panic, of a mind and body reliving some past horror. He had seen it in the mirror often enough during his own dark years. "Look at me," he said, his voice low and steady. "Caroline, look at my eyes." Her gaze found his, and he held it, letting her anchor herself to the present moment, to the reality of the sunny street and the mundane packages, and the large, solid man standing beside her. "That is right," Ezra continued. "You're on Main Street in Silver Creek, Montana. It is Thursday afternoon. The sun is shining. You were carrying packages from Chester's store. A door slammed, but it was only the wind. You are safe." Slowly, gradually, the rigid terror began to drain from Caroline's posture. Her breathing deepened. Color returned to her face. She blinked several times, and when she focused on him again, her eyes were clearer, more present. "I am sorry," she whispered. "No apologies," Ezra said firmly. "Can I carry these for you?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Ezra gathered up all the packages, tucking them under one arm while offering her his other elbow. After a moment's hesitation, Caroline placed her hand on his forearm, her touch light as a bird. They walked to the boarding house in silence. Mrs. Pemberton met them on the porch, her round face creased with concern. "Caroline, dear, are you well?" "She is fine," Ezra answered when Caroline did not immediately respond. "Just a momentary spell. Where would you like these packages, Mrs. Pemberton?" "Bring them to the kitchen, Mr. Blackwood." "That is very kind of you." Ezra followed Martha into the boarding house, acutely aware of Caroline trailing behind them. The interior was clean and well-maintained, with floral wallpaper and dark wood furniture that showed years of careful use. The kitchen was spacious, with a large cast-iron stove and a table that could seat a dozen people. He set the packages on the table, then turned to find Caroline standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small and lost, and something in Ezra's chest tightened painfully. "Thank you," she said, "for your help, for your kindness, for not asking questions." "You do not owe me explanations," Ezra replied. "But if you ever want to talk, I am a good listener. The mountains teach a man to be comfortable with silence and patient with words." Caroline studied him with those dark, wary eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not even know me." "Does a man need a reason to offer kindness?" "In my experience, yes. Everyone wants something." The bitterness in her voice spoke volumes. Ezra chose his next words carefully. "I want nothing from you except perhaps the chance to know you better. If you are not interested in that, I will respect your wishes and keep my distance. But I would consider it an honor if you would allow me to call on you." Mrs. Pemberton, who had been making herself busy at the stove, shot Ezra an approving look. Caroline, however, seemed stunned by the straightforward declaration. "Call on me?" she repeated. "You want to court me?" "I want to spend time with you," Ezra clarified. "I want to talk with you, to understand what makes you smile, what you think about when you are alone, what dreams you carry. If that leads to courtship, I would be pleased. If it leads to friendship, I would be equally pleased. And if you decide you want nothing to do with me, I will accept that as well." For a long moment, Caroline said nothing. Then, so quietly Ezra almost missed it, she said, "I have not had a friend in a very long time." "Then let me be your friend," she nodded slowly. "All right. But you should know that I am damaged goods, Mr. Blackwood. I come with more troubles than any sensible man would want to take on." "We are all damaged in one way or another," Ezra said. "And as it happens, I am not always sensible. The mountains will attest to that." The corner of Caroline's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to make Ezra's heart lift. "Very well, but please, call me Caroline. If we are to be friends, we should at least use our given names. Then you must call me Ezra." Over the next several days, Ezra found himself spending more and more time in Caroline's company. They fell into an easy rhythm, meeting for walks in the cooler morning hours before the summer heat became oppressive, sitting together on the boarding house porch in the evenings while Martha served lemonade and kept a respectable but permissive eye on them, sharing quiet conversations about everything and nothing. Ezra learned that Caroline was 23 years old, originally from Ohio, and had been married for 2 years to a man named Gerald Sutton. She did not speak much about her marriage, and Ezra did not press, but the pieces she did share painted a grim picture. Gerald had been charming during their courtship, attentive and generous, but once the wedding was over, he had changed, becoming controlling, jealous, and eventually violent. "I tried to leave twice," Caroline told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "The first time, he found me before I made it out of Denver. He was so angry. He said I had embarrassed him, made him look like a fool. He promised it would never happen again if I just came home and behaved properly." She paused, her fingers twisting in her lap. "The second time, I made it as far as Colorado Springs. He caught up to me there. That time he broke 2 of my ribs and told me that if I ever tried to run again, he would kill me." Ezra's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. The urge to hunt down this Gerald Sutton and introduce him to the kind of justice that could only be found at the end of a fist was almost overwhelming. But he forced himself to remain still, to listen, to let Caroline speak at her own pace. "So I stayed," she continued. "For another 6 months I stayed. I became very good at anticipating his moods, at making myself invisible, at not provoking him. But it was never enough. There was always something wrong, something I had done or failed to do. And the violence got worse." "What changed?" Ezra asked quietly. "He killed our neighbor's dog," Caroline said, her voice flat. "It was a little terrier that belonged to Mrs. Henderson next door. The dog had barked at Gerald one too many times, I suppose. He broke its neck and threw it in the alley like it was garbage. When I saw that, I realized that if I stayed, he would eventually kill me too. So I waited until he went on a business trip to Cheyenne, packed what little I could carry, took every cent I had managed to hide, and ran. I've been running ever since." "He's looking for you?" "I assume so. Gerald does not like to lose his possessions, and that is all I ever was to him. A possession." She turned to look at Ezra, and in the fading light, her eyes were luminous with unshed tears. "That is why I flinch. That is why I cannot bear the sound of doors slamming or sudden movements or raised voices. My body remembers, even when I try to forget." Ezra reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cool, and they trembled slightly against his palm. "You do not have to run anymore," he said. "Not if you do not want to. He will find me eventually. Men like Gerald always do. Then he will have to go through me first." Caroline shook her head. "You do not understand. He's not some cowboy who will back down from a fight. He has money, connections. He was a banker in Denver, well-respected, well-liked. No one would believe me if I told them what he's really like." "I believe you." The simplicity of that statement seemed to break something inside Caroline. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you believe me? Why do you care?" "Because I know what it is to survive something that should have destroyed you," Ezra said. "Because I see your strength, even when you cannot see it yourself. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth knowing, worth protecting, worth caring about." Caroline pulled her hand from his and stood abruptly. "You should not care about me, Ezra. I am broken. I wake up from nightmares screaming. I cannot bear to be touched without warning. I flinch at shadows and jump at my own reflection. What kind of future could I possibly offer anyone?" Ezra rose as well, but he kept his distance, respecting the space she had created between them. "You are not broken. You are healing. There is a difference. You do not know that." "Yes, I do." He paused, considering how much to reveal. Trust had to flow both ways. 15 years ago, when I was 18, my family was killed by raiders, outlaws who came in the night, burned our farm, murdered my parents and my younger sisters while I hid in the root cellar like a coward. I was supposed to be out checking the far fence line, but I had come back early. I heard the gunshots, the screaming, and I hid. I survived, and they died. Caroline's hand flew to her mouth. "Ezra, I'm so sorry. For a long time after that, I was exactly what you described. Broken. I could not sleep without dreaming of fire and blood. I could not be around people without feeling like I was about to crawl out of my own skin. I drank too much, fought too much, nearly got myself killed more times than I can count. I thought I was ruined, that there was no coming back from what I had experienced. What changed? I went into the mountains. I had nothing left to lose, and I figured if I was going to die, I might as well do it somewhere beautiful. But up there, away from everything, I started to heal. The mountains did not judge me. They did not expect me to be anything other than what I was. And slowly, over months and then years, I found my way back to myself. Not the person I was before, but someone new, someone stronger. He took a half step toward her, watching her carefully for any sign of discomfort. When she did not retreat, he continued. You are doing that same work now, Caroline. You escaped, you survived, you are building a new life. That takes more courage than most people possess. So no, you are not broken. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. Caroline wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. I want to believe that. Then believe it. And let me help you believe it. She looked at him for a long moment, and Ezra saw the exact instant when she made her decision. It was there in the way her shoulders straightened, in the way she lifted her chin, in the way she met his eyes without flinching. All right, she said. All right. From that night forward, something shifted between them. The easy friendship they had been building deepened into something more profound, more intimate. Ezra made a conscious effort to never startle Caroline, to announce his presence before approaching, to move slowly and deliberately around her. He paid attention to the things that triggered her anxiety and went out of his way to mitigate them. When they walked together, he positioned himself between her and the street, creating a physical barrier between her and the chaos of town life. When they sat together, he always left her an easy path to the door, never blocking her exit, and he made it his mission to ensure that no door slammed within her vicinity. The people of Silver Creek noticed and followed suit. At the church, Reverend Walsh installed a hydraulic door closer that prevented the heavy wooden door from slamming. Chester Holbrook placed a wedge by his trading post entrance, keeping it propped open whenever Caroline was inside. Duncan the blacksmith took to hanging a sign during her usual walking times. Quiet hours, precision work in progress, which was his way of warning his customers that the hammering would pause temporarily. But it was Ezra who was most vigilant. He took to anticipating not just Caroline's movements, but the movements of everyone around her. When a drunk cowhand stumbled out of the saloon, Ezra was there to catch the door before it could slam. When a gust of wind threatened to bang the gate at the churchyard, Ezra secured it with a bit of rope. When a wagon wheel hit a pothole with a loud crack, Ezra was already moving to stand beside Caroline, his solid presence a reminder that she was safe, that she was not alone. Caroline noticed, of course. She would have had to be blind not to see what Ezra was doing, how much care and attention he devoted to her comfort. And slowly, gradually, she began to relax in his presence. Her smiles came more easily. Her laughter, when he managed to coax it from her, was genuine and unguarded. She still flinched at sudden noises, still carried her wariness like a second skin, but with Ezra, she could breathe. 3 weeks after they had first met, Ezra took Caroline on a picnic to a meadow just outside of town. It was a beautiful spot, ringed by pine trees and carpeted with wildflowers, with a small creek burbling through the center. The summer air was warm but not oppressive, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. They spread a blanket beneath the shade of a large pine and shared the lunch that Mrs. Pemberton had packed for them: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of lemonade. As they ate, they talked about inconsequential things: the weather, the town gossip, the new family that had just arrived from back east. But underneath the casual conversation, there was a current of something deeper, something that made Ezra's pulse quicken and his chest feel too small for his heart. After they had finished eating, Caroline lay back on the blanket, staring up at the sky through the pine branches. "I could stay here forever," she said softly. "It is so peaceful." Ezra propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her. The dappled sunlight played across her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheekbone, the soft fullness of her lips. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real, genuine. Everything false and superficial had been burned away by her experiences, leaving only the essential core of who she was. "Come with me," he said impulsively. Caroline turned her head to look at him. "What?" "Come with me to the mountains. My cabin is about 2 days' ride from here, up in the Bitterroot Range. It is remote, quiet, safe. No one would find you there." Ezra, I cannot just... Why not? He sat up fully now, warming to the idea even as it formed. What is keeping you in Silver Creek? You have no family here, no permanent employment. You are just waiting for Gerald to catch up to you. But in the mountains, you could have a real life. You could be free. People would talk, Caroline said, but her voice lacked conviction. Let them talk. We are a 2-day ride from the nearest town. Their opinions do not reach that far. I would be compromising your reputation as well as my own. I have no reputation to compromise. I am a mountain man, Caroline. Society gave up on me long ago. She sat up, hugging her knees to her chest. What are you asking, Ezra? Are you asking me to come live in sin with you in your cabin? Or are you asking something else? Ezra had never been a man for flowery speeches or romantic gestures. He dealt in plain truths, in actions rather than words. But in that moment, with Caroline looking at him with those wide, vulnerable eyes, he found words he did not know he possessed. I am asking you to marry me, he said. I am asking you to be my wife, to share my life, to let me protect you and care for you for whatever time we are granted. I know we have not known each other long. I know you have every reason to be wary of men in marriage, but I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that I will never raise my hand to you in anger. I will never seek to control you or diminish you. I will never be what he was. Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. How can you promise that? How can you know what you will be? Because I know who I am, Ezra said simply. I have lived alone in the mountains for 12 years, Caroline. I have had nothing but time to understand my own nature, my own heart. I am not a perfect man. I am rough and crude and more comfortable with animals than people, but I am good. I am kind, and I love you. You love me? Caroline whispered. I love you, Ezra confirmed. I have loved you since the moment I saw you flinch at that slamming door and then force yourself to stand up anyway. I loved you when you apologized for your fear, even though you had nothing to apologize for. I love your strength, your resilience, your refusal to be broken by what you have endured. I love the way you bite your lower lip when you are concentrating on your sewing. I love the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I love you, Caroline, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to flinch again. Caroline covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Ezra watched her, his heart in his throat waiting. After a long moment, she lowered her hands and looked at him through her tears. I am still married, she said. Legally, I am still Gerald's wife. We can fix that. We will file for divorce or annulment or whatever legal remedy exists, and if we cannot, then we will live as man and wife in every way that matters, and damn the legal paperwork. He might still find me. Then I will deal with him. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, Ezra said. Not easy, but simple. You decide what you want. Then you take the steps necessary to get it. So what do you want, Caroline? She looked at him for a long time, and Ezra could see the war playing out behind her eyes, fear battling hope, caution wrestling with desire. Finally, she took a deep, shuddering breath and said, I want you. I want a life with you. I want to wake up every morning without fear. I want to go to sleep every night feeling safe. I want to heal, and I want to do it with you beside me. Relief and joy flooded through Ezra in equal measure. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. Then you shall have all of that and more. I promise you, Caroline. I will spend the rest of my life keeping that promise. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and gentle, a mere brush of lips that asked rather than demanded. Caroline froze for just an instant, then melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. The kiss deepened, still tender but growing more assured as Caroline's fear gave way to trust, to need, to something that felt startlingly like joy. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Caroline laughed shakily. I think that is the first time I have been kissed without feeling afraid. That's the first of many then, Ezra said, grinning. I intend to kiss you often. I think I would like that. They returned to Silver Creek late that afternoon, walking close together, Caroline's hand tucked into the crook of Ezra's arm. The news of their engagement spread through the small town like wildfire, and while there were some raised eyebrows at the speed of the courtship, most people seemed genuinely happy for them. Mrs. Pemberton was particularly delighted, declaring that she had known from the start that Ezra and Caroline were meant for each other. Reverend Walsh agreed to perform the ceremony, though he gently suggested that they should wait a few weeks to ensure they were certain of their decision. Ezra agreed, more for Caroline's sake than his own. He was certain, had been certain almost from the beginning, but he understood that Caroline needed time to fully trust in this new future they were building together. During those weeks of waiting, Ezra continued his patient campaign to help Caroline heal. He spent hours teaching her to shoot, placing a rifle in her hands and showing her how to load, aim, and fire. "You should know how to protect yourself," he explained, "not because I will not be there to protect you, but because you deserve to feel capable." Caroline proved to be a quick study, her hands steady and her eyes sharp. The first time she hit the center of the target, she turned to Ezra with such a brilliant smile that he felt his breath catch. "I did it!" she exclaimed. "You did," Ezra confirmed, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You are remarkable, do you know that?" "I'm beginning to believe it," she said, and the wonder in her voice made Ezra's heart ache. He also began taking her on longer rides outside of town, gradually building her comfort with the wilderness that would soon be her home. They explored the foothills of the Bitterroots, riding through stands of pine and aspen, following game trails to hidden clearings and crystal-clear streams. Ezra taught her to read the land, to identify animal tracks, to distinguish between edible and poisonous plants. Caroline soaked up the knowledge eagerly, clearly relishing the sense of competence that came with each new skill mastered. But it was the small moments that meant the most to Ezra. The way Caroline now reached for his hand without hesitation, the way she leaned into his embrace when they sat together on the boarding house porch, the way she laughed freely, the sound like music after the constrained silence of her earlier days in Silver Creek. She still flinched occasionally at sudden noises, but the fear no longer consumed her. She was learning to trust again, to hope again, to believe in the possibility of happiness. 4 weeks after Ezra had proposed, they stood before Reverend Walsh in the small Silver Creek church and exchanged vows. Caroline wore a simple dress of ivory cotton that Mrs. Pemberton had helped her make, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Ezra wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed and his beard freshly trimmed. They looked, by all accounts, like any other frontier couple beginning their life together. But when Ezra slipped a simple gold band onto Caroline's finger and spoke his vows, his voice was thick with emotion. "I take you, Caroline, as my wife. I promise to honor you, to protect you, to stand between you and harm. I promise to be patient with your healing, to celebrate your strength, to love you through every moment of joy and sorrow. I promise to make our home a place of peace and safety, where doors never slam and fear has no power. This is my vow to you before God and these witnesses." Caroline's hands trembled as she placed a matching gold band on Ezra's finger, but her voice was steady. "I take you, Ezra, as my husband. I promise to trust you with my heart, to meet your strength with my own, to build a life with you in the mountains you love. I promise to honor the man you are, to celebrate your kindness, to love you through every season we are given. This is my vow to you before God and these witnesses." When Reverend Walsh pronounced them man and wife, Ezra kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one eye in the assembled congregation. And when they turned to face their friends and neighbors, Caroline was smiling with such radiant happiness that even the hardened cowboys and miners had to smile in response. The town threw them a modest celebration at the boarding house, with food and music and enough whiskey to ensure that everyone would have sore heads the next morning. Ezra danced with his wife, his large frame surprisingly graceful as he guided her around the parlor floor. Caroline laughed as he spun her, her eyes bright, her face flushed with joy and exertion. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, Mrs. Pemberton pulled Caroline aside. "You are sure about this, dear? About leaving town and going to live in the wilderness?" "I am sure," Caroline said without hesitation. "Ezra is my home now. Wherever he is, that is where I belong." Martha nodded, satisfied. "He is a good man. I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he moves around you. He will take care of you." "We will take care of each other," Caroline corrected gently. 2 days later, with their belongings packed onto 2 horses and enough supplies to see them through to winter, Ezra and Caroline set out for the mountains. The journey took them through some of the most spectacular country Caroline had ever seen. Deep forests where the light filtered green through the canopy, high meadows carpeted with wildflowers, rushing rivers cold with snowmelt, and always in the distance, the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Range standing like sentinels against the sky. Ezra watched Caroline carefully during the journey, alert for any signs of fear or regret, but what he saw instead was wonder. She marveled at everything, the way the morning mist clung to the valleys, the call of an eagle soaring overhead, the delicate beauty of a doe and her fawn drinking from a stream. At night, they camped beneath the stars, and Ezra taught Caroline the names of the constellations while she nestled close to his side, wrapped in blankets and utterly content. They reached Ezra's cabin on the afternoon of the third day. It was located in a small valley, surrounded by pine forest on 3 sides and opening onto a meadow on the 4th. A stream ran nearby, providing fresh water year-round. The cabin itself was solidly built from logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. It was small, just a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, but it was clean and well-maintained, with real glass windows and a sturdy door. Ezra dismounted and helped Caroline down from her horse, then stood back to gauge her reaction. "It is not much," he said, suddenly nervous, "but it is solid and warm, and the roof does not leak." Caroline walked slowly around the clearing, taking it all in. She peered through the windows, examined the wood pile stacked neatly against the side of the cabin, tested the soundness of the porch steps. Finally, she turned to Ezra, and her smile was radiant. "It is perfect," she said. "It is absolutely perfect." Relief washed over Ezra. He grabbed her around the waist and lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her in a circle while she laughed and protested. When he set her down, he kissed her soundly, then lifted her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," he said. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackwood," Caroline replied, and kissed him again. The first weeks in the mountains were a period of adjustment for them both. Caroline had never lived so remotely, had never experienced such profound silence and solitude. At first, she found it unnerving. The absence of human noise, no wagon wheels clattering over cobblestones, no saloon pianos playing late into the night, no vendors calling their wares, left her feeling exposed in a way she had not anticipated. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush sent her heart racing. But Ezra was patient. He taught her to distinguish between the normal sounds of the forest and those that signaled potential danger. He showed her how to read the behavior of the birds and animals, how their sudden silence could indicate a predator's presence, while their relaxed foraging meant all was well. He accustomed her to the rifle he insisted she keep near the door, making sure she could load and fire it competently, though he fervently hoped she would never need to. And true to his word, Ezra made sure that their home was a place of peace. He installed a hydraulic closer on the cabin door, similar to the one Reverend Walsh had used at the church, ensuring it could never slam shut. He built a small mudroom entrance that created a buffer between the outside world and their living space, further muffling any sudden sounds. He even went so far as to pad the inside of the kitchen cabinet doors with leather so they would close silently. Caroline noticed every single one of these small considerations, and each one made her love him more. But more than the physical modifications, it was Ezra's presence that soothed her. He was a constant, solid reassurance. When nightmares woke her in the darkness, gasping and disoriented, he was there to pull her close and murmur reassurances until her heartbeat slowed and sleep claimed her again. When sudden memories of Gerald and the violence she had endured threatened to overwhelm her, Ezra was there with his quiet strength, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply being present. As summer gave way to autumn, Caroline found herself settling into their new life with surprising ease. She took over much of the domestic work, cooking their meals, tending the small vegetable garden Ezra had planted, preserving food for the winter months ahead. But she also insisted on learning the skills necessary for mountain survival. Ezra taught her to skin and butcher game, to tan hides, to set snares and check trap lines. At first, these tasks made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to persist, understanding that her survival might one day depend on these abilities. In turn, Caroline brought refinements to Ezra's Spartan existence that he had not realized he was missing. She made curtains for the windows from fabric she'd brought from Silver Creek, softening the harsh mountain light. She planted wildflowers around the cabin, bringing color and beauty to the utilitarian space. She filled the evenings with stories and songs, her voice chasing away the loneliness that had been Ezra's constant companion for so many years. They fell into an easy partnership, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for their weaknesses. And as the days shortened and the nights grew cold, their physical relationship deepened into something profound and transformative. Caroline had been terrified of this aspect of marriage, her experiences with Gerald having taught her that intimacy was something to be endured rather than enjoyed. But Ezra approached their marriage bed with the same patience and care he brought to everything concerning Caroline. He never rushed, never demanded, never took, without ensuring she was willing and ready. The first time they made love, he spent what felt like hours simply holding her, stroking her hair, murmuring words of love and reassurance until her trembling stopped and curiosity began to override fear. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he told her. "There is no hurry. We have the rest of our lives." But Caroline was ready, or as ready as she thought she would ever be. "I want this," she said. "I want to know what it should be like. I want to replace those memories with new ones." And so Ezra loved her with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes, attentive to every response, every catch of breath, every small sound. He made it about her pleasure, her comfort, her journey toward reclaiming her own body. And when it was over, Caroline wept in his arms, not from pain or fear, but from relief and gratitude, and a joy so intense it felt almost painful. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" Ezra asked, his hand tracing lazy circles on her back. "For showing me what love is supposed to feel like, for being patient with me, for being you." Ezra kissed the top of her head. "You never have to thank me for loving you, Caroline. It is the easiest thing I have ever done." As autumn deepened into winter, they prepared for the long, cold months ahead. Ezra spent his days hunting and cutting firewood, building up their stores of both meat and fuel. Caroline worked tirelessly to preserve everything they harvested from the garden, canning vegetables and making preserves, smoking and drying meat, rendering fat for candles and cooking. They worked from dawn until dusk, racing against the coming snows. The first blizzard hit in early November, a howling fury of wind and snow that lasted 3 days and left drifts taller than a man piled against the cabin walls. Caroline, who had never experienced a true mountain winter, watched the storm with wide eyes, marveling at the sheer power of nature unleashed. "Are we safe?" she asked Ezra, as the wind screamed around the cabin, rattling the shutters despite their sturdy construction. "We are safe," Ezra assured her. "This cabin has weathered worse storms than this. We have food, water, firewood. We could be snowed in for a month and survive comfortably." As it turned out, they were not snowed in for quite that long, but the winter was hard nonetheless. The temperatures plummeted and the snow piled higher and higher. For weeks at a time, they were completely cut off from the outside world, their universe reduced to the 4 walls of the cabin and the immediate clearing around it. But rather than feeling trapped, Caroline found that she treasured this forced isolation. Here, buried in the mountains under a blanket of snow, she felt safer than she had in years. Gerald could not reach her here. No one could. It was just her and Ezra, and that was more than enough. They filled the long winter evenings with conversation, with reading from the small collection of books Ezra had accumulated over the years, with teaching each other skills. Caroline showed Ezra how to knit, while he taught her to carve wood. They made love with slow, tender passion, learning each other's bodies with the kind of attention and care that came from having all the time in the world. And Caroline continued to heal. The nightmares came less frequently. The flinching diminished. She could make it through entire days without thinking of Gerald, without feeling the phantom pressure of his hands around her throat. The mountains and the man who loved her were working a kind of magic, knitting together the fractured pieces of her soul. It was during that first winter, in the depths of January, that Caroline realized she was pregnant. At first she was not certain, but as the weeks passed and her monthly courses failed to arrive, as her breasts grew tender and nausea plagued her mornings, the truth became undeniable. She told Ezra one evening as they sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "I'm with child," she said simply. Ezra went very still. Then he pulled back to look at her face, his eyes searching hers. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation." A slow smile spread across Ezra's face, transforming his usually serious features into something boyish and joyful. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. Then, louder, "We're going to have a baby!" He swept Caroline into his arms, lifting her off the floor and spinning her around just as he had on their wedding day. Caroline laughed, dizzy with relief and happiness. She had not been sure how Ezra would react, had worried that a child might be an unwelcome complication in their remote life. But she should have known better. Ezra met everything with the same steady competence, the same unshakable confidence that they could handle whatever came their way. "We should go to Silver Creek," Caroline said when Ezra had set her down and they had both caught their breath. "I should see a doctor, make sure everything is well." "We will go as soon as the pass is clear in the spring," Ezra promised. "Until then, we will take very good care of you. No heavy lifting, plenty of rest, all the food you can eat." "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Caroline protested, laughing. "Perhaps not, but you are carrying something precious, and I will not take any chances." True to his word, Ezra became almost comically protective. He took over all the heavy chores, insisting that Caroline rest whenever possible. He brought her breakfast in bed each morning, checked on her constantly throughout the day, and fussed over her like a mother hen. Caroline found it both endearing and occasionally exasperating, but she could not deny that she loved the attention, loved being cared for with such devotion. As winter finally loosened its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, they prepared for the journey to Silver Creek. The trip would be more challenging than it had been the previous summer, as Caroline was now 4 months along and her pregnancy was becoming more apparent, but both agreed that seeing a doctor was worth the difficulty. They arrived in Silver Creek in late March to a warm welcome from their friends. Mrs. Pemberton wept with joy at the news of the coming baby and immediately set about preparing for a proper baby shower. The town doctor, an elderly man named Samuel Hart, examined Caroline and pronounced her and the baby in excellent health. "You are doing everything right, doctor," Hart told them. "Keep eating well, get plenty of rest, and try not to worry. First babies usually take their time coming, so you have a good 4 or 5 months yet." They stayed in Silver Creek for 2 weeks, visiting with friends, restocking their supplies, and simply enjoying the novelty of being around other people. But Caroline found that she was eager to return to the mountains, to the peace and quiet of their cabin. Silver Creek felt too loud now, too crowded, too unpredictable. She had become a creature of the wilderness, and the wilderness was calling her home. The journey back to the cabin was slow but uneventful. Ezra was excessively cautious, stopping frequently to let Caroline rest, choosing the smoothest paths even when it meant going out of their way. Caroline bore his fussing with good humor, understanding that it came from a place of love and concern. They spent the summer preparing for the baby's arrival. Ezra built a cradle from pine, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk, then rubbing it with oil until it gleamed. Caroline sewed tiny clothes from soft cotton, her hands flying as she created a layette for their coming child. They discussed names endlessly, unable to agree but enjoying the debate nonetheless. In September, as the aspens began to turn gold and the air took on the crisp edge of coming autumn, Caroline went into labor. It was late afternoon, and Ezra had been out checking his trap lines. Caroline was in the cabin, kneading bread dough, when the first contraction hit. She gasped, her hands stilling on the dough, and for a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. She was about to give birth in a cabin miles from medical help, with only her husband to assist her. But then she took a deep breath and forced herself to think logically. Women had been giving birth since the beginning of time, often in far worse circumstances than these. She was strong. Ezra was capable. They could do this. By the time Ezra returned an hour later, Caroline had already prepared as best she could, laying out clean linens, heating water, timing her contractions. Ezra took one look at her face and immediately understood what was happening. "The baby is coming?" he asked, his voice remarkably calm despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "The baby is coming," Caroline confirmed. What followed was the longest night of both their lives, Labor was hard, painful, and exhausting in ways Carolyn had not imagined. But Ezra was there through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement, never once flinching from the blood or the mess or Caroline's cries. He was a rock, an anchor, exactly what she needed. As dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Caroline gave one final mighty push, and their son entered the world. He was tiny and red and screaming, his small fists waving in indignation at this sudden change in circumstances. Ezra cut the cord with shaking hands, then wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and placed him in Caroline's arms. "You did it," Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were magnificent." Caroline looked down at the small face of her son, at his button nose and the wisp of dark hair on his head, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Daniel, after Ezra's father, and he was perfect in every way. He had Ezra's dark hair and Caroline's eyes, and from the first moment he owned them both completely. Ezra proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring Daniel to Caroline for feeding, changing his tiny clothes with surprising deftness for such large hands, carrying him around the cabin in the crook of his arm, while singing old ballads in a deep rumbling baritone that never failed to soothe the baby. Caroline watched her husband with their son and fell even more deeply in love. This huge, powerful man who could fell trees and track game and survive brutal winters was reduced to helpless adoration by 8 pounds of infant. He spoke to Daniel constantly, narrating everything he did as though the baby could understand. "Now we're going to check the rabbit snares, little man. Do you see this track here? That is from a fox. We will need to watch out for him." Daniel would gurgle and wave his fists, and Ezra would nod seriously as though they were having a profound conversation. The first year of Daniel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and tiny milestones. His first smile, his first laugh, the first time he rolled over, the first time he sat up unsupported, each achievement was celebrated as though he had accomplished something miraculous. And to his parents, he had. Carolyn found motherhood both harder and more rewarding than she had anticipated. There were moments of crushing exhaustion, of frustration when Daniel would not stop crying and she could not figure out what he needed. But there were also moments of pure, transcendent joy. The weight of his small body in her arms, the sweet smell of his head, the way his face lit up when he saw her or Ezra. And through it all, Ezra remained her steadfast support. He took on extra work to give Caroline time to rest, never complained about the disruption a baby brought to their previously orderly life, and continued to make sure that their home remained a place of peace. Doors still never slammed. Loud noises were minimized. The cabin was a sanctuary of calm, and Caroline thrived in it. When spring came again and the passes cleared, they made the journey to Silver Creek to have Daniel baptized. The town was delighted to see them, and even more delighted to meet the newest addition to the Blackwood family. Daniel was passed from person to person, exclaimed over, dandled, and spoiled outrageously. Mrs. Pemberton declared him the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, and Reverend Walsh performed the baptism with tears in his eyes, moved by the sight of this small family that had overcome so much. But the visit was marred by news that sent ice through Caroline's veins. Chester Holbrook pulled Ezra aside privately, his usually jovial face grave. "There was a man here last week asking questions," Chester said quietly. "Well-dressed fellow from Denver, said he was looking for his wife. Described her as having copper-colored hair, small build, might be using a false name. Said her name was Caroline Sutton and that she had run away nearly 2 years ago." Ezra's jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Chester said firmly. "None of us said a word. We do not know anyone by that name, and even if we did, we would not hand her over to some stranger just because he claims to be her husband. But Ezra, he seemed determined. He said he had hired men to search the entire Montana territory, said he would not stop until he found her." "How long ago did he leave?" 5 days. He was heading north toward Fort Benton, but I have no doubt he will be back through here eventually." Ezra thanked Chester for the warning and returned to the boarding house where Caroline was visiting with Martha. He pulled her aside and relayed what he had learned, watching her face drain of color as she processed the information. "He found me," she whispered. I knew he would eventually, but I had hoped we would have more time. Listen to me, Ezra said, taking both her hands in his. He has not found you yet. He is searching, but he has not found you. And even if he does track you to Silver Creek, no one here will betray you. These people are your friends, Caroline. They will protect you. But what if he finds the cabin? What if he comes for me there? Then I will deal with him. Ezra's voice was flat, carrying an edge of danger that Caroline had never heard from him before. He will not take you from me. He will not take you from Daniel. I swear this to you. They cut their visit short, leaving Silver Creek the next morning and pushing hard to reach the cabin as quickly as possible. Ezra's mind raced during the journey, calculating angles, planning contingencies. He would not let Gerald Sutton destroy the life they had built. He could not. Back at the cabin, Ezra took steps to ensure their safety. He taught Caroline to be even more proficient with the rifle, drilling her until she could hit a target at 50 yards with consistent accuracy. He showed her hiding places in the forest around the cabin, spots where she could conceal herself and Daniel if danger approached. He even began laying false trails when he went out hunting or checking traps, creating confusion for anyone who might try to track them. But weeks passed, then months, and Gerald did not appear. Summer faded into autumn, and still there was no sign of pursuit. Caroline began to relax slightly, to hope that perhaps Gerald had given up, that perhaps he had concluded she was not worth the effort of continued searching. It was a cold November afternoon when Gerald finally found them. Ezra was out checking his northern trap line, a circuit that took most of the day. Caroline was in the cabin with Daniel, who was just over a year old and starting to take his first wobbling steps. She was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables for stew, while Daniel played on a blanket near the fire with a set of wooden blocks Ezra had carved for him. She heard the horse before she saw it, the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground, unmistakable in the silence of the forest. Her heart leaped into her throat. Ezra was not due back for hours, and they never had visitors this far into the mountains. Caroline scooped up Daniel and moved quickly to the window, peering out through the gap in the curtains. A single rider was approaching the cabin, a well-dressed man on a fine black horse. Even at a distance, even after nearly 2 years, Caroline recognized him instantly. Gerald. Terror threatened to paralyze her, but she forced herself to move. She grabbed the rifle from its place beside the door and checked that it was loaded. Then she moved to the corner of the cabin farthest from the door, positioning herself so that she had a clear line of sight to the entrance, while keeping Daniel shielded behind her body. Gerald dismounted and approached the cabin. He knocked on the door, the sound sharp and commanding. "Caroline," he called, "I know you are in there. Open the door." Caroline said nothing, her hands tight on the rifle. Daniel, sensing her fear, began to whimper. "Caroline, do not be foolish," Gerald continued, his voice taking on that familiar, reasonable tone that had always preceded violence. "You are my wife. You belong with me. This little adventure has gone on long enough. It is time to come home." Still, Caroline remained silent. Her mind raced. Ezra would not be back for hours. She was on her own. Gerald tried the door handle and found it locked. "Caroline, if you do not open this door, I will break it down. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." The door suddenly shuddered under a heavy impact as Gerald threw his shoulder against it. Caroline's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. The door held. Ezra had built it solid, but it would not withstand repeated assaults. "Caroline!" Gerald's voice was rising now, the civilized veneer cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "Open this door right now, or I swear I will make you regret it." The door shuddered again under another impact, and then a third time. The frame was beginning to splinter. Caroline made a decision. She moved to the window on the side of the cabin farthest from the door, opened it, and called out, "Gerald, stop!" Gerald ceased his assault on the door and moved around the cabin until he could see her through the open window. His face was red with exertion and anger, his usually immaculate hair disheveled. "So you can speak," he said coldly. "Come out here, Caroline, now." "No," Caroline said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Gerald. Our marriage is over. I want nothing more to do with you." Gerald's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Our marriage is over when I say it is over. You do not get to just leave, Caroline. You made vows. Before God, you promised to honor and obey me. And you promised to love and cherish me, Caroline shot back. You broke those vows every time you raised your hand to me, every time you told me I was worthless, every time you made me feel like I was nothing. So yes, our marriage is over. You have been living in sin with that mountain savage, Gerald sneered. Do you think I do not know about him? The entire town knows about your shame, about how you spread your legs for some primitive brute who does not even know how to wear proper clothes. Rage flared hot in Caroline's chest, burning away the fear. That primitive brute is more of a man than you could ever hope to be. He is kind and gentle and good. He has never once made me afraid. He has shown me what real love looks like, and it is nothing like what you and I had. Gerald's face darkened. Where is he? Where is your protector now, Caroline? It seems you are all alone. I am not alone. Caroline shifted the rifle so that it was visible through the window, the barrel pointed directly at Gerald's chest. And I am not helpless. Leave, Gerald. Leave now and do not come back. Gerald stared at the rifle, then at Caroline's face. He must have seen the determination there, the absolute resolve, because for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. You would not shoot me, he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Try me, Caroline said flatly. You terrorized me for years, Gerald. You beat me, belittled me, made every day a waking nightmare. But that woman is gone. The woman standing here now will not be victimized again. I will protect myself and my child, and if that means putting a bullet in you, then so be it. Your child? Gerald's eyes widened. You had a bastard with that savage? I have a son with my husband, Caroline corrected coldly. His name is Daniel, and he is legitimate in every way that matters. Now leave, Gerald. This is your last warning. For a long moment, Gerald simply stood there, staring at her. Then he smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Caroline had ever seen on his face. Very well, he said. If you will not come willingly, I will simply wait. Your mountain man will return eventually, and when he does, I will kill him. Then, we will see how defiant you are. He walked back to his horse, retrieved a rifle from his saddle scabbard, and took up a position behind a tree with a clear view of the cabin's front door. He was settling in to wait, to ambush Ezra the moment he returned. Caroline's blood ran cold. She could not let that happen. She had to warn Ezra somehow, had to prevent him from walking into a trap. But how? She could not leave the cabin with Daniel, could not risk Gerald capturing them. And she did not dare shoot Gerald from this distance with Daniel so close. If she missed, or if the sound frightened Daniel into crying and disrupting her aim, the consequences could be fatal. She was trapped, and the only thing she could do was wait and pray that Ezra would somehow sense the danger before he rode into it. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Caroline kept watch through the window, monitoring Gerald's position. He remained behind the tree, patient and still, his rifle resting across his knees. Daniel grew fussy, hungry, and uncomfortable, but Caroline did not dare make any significant movements that might draw Gerald's attention or reveal her position more clearly. She fed Daniel quietly, whispering reassurances she did not feel, all while keeping the rifle within easy reach. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In another hour, maybe two, Ezra would return, and when he did, Gerald would try to kill him. Unless Caroline could find a way to stop it, an idea began to form in her mind, desperate and risky, but possibly their only chance. She waited until full dark had fallen, until the only light came from the moon and the faint glow of the fire visible through the cabin windows. Then she moved. She wrapped Daniel securely in a thick blanket and placed him in his cradle, tucking him in tightly. He was already drowsing, exhausted from the day's tension, even though he did not understand it. Caroline kissed his forehead, whispering, "Mama will be right back, sweetheart. I promise." Then she took the rifle, eased open the back window of the cabin, and slipped out into the night. The cold hit her immediately. It was well below freezing, and she had not taken time to grab her coat. But she ignored the chill, focusing instead on moving silently through the forest. She had spent more than a year learning this land, learning how to move quietly, how to use the shadows. Now she put those skills to use. She circled wide around Gerald's position, using the trees for cover, placing each foot with excruciating care to avoid snapping any branches or crunching any leaves. It took nearly 30 minutes to work her way around behind him, but finally she was in position, no more than 15 feet from where he crouched. Caroline raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel at Gerald's back. Her hands were steady, her breathing was controlled. Everything Ezra had taught her came flooding back. "Gerald," she said quietly. He spun around, his own rifle coming up, but Caroline had the advantage of being already aimed. "Drop the rifle," she ordered. "Do it now, or I will shoot you where you sit." For a moment, she thought he might try to call her bluff, but something in her voice, or perhaps in her stance, convinced him she was serious. He lowered his rifle carefully, setting it on the ground beside him. "Good," Caroline said. "Now stand up, slowly." Gerald rose to his feet, his hands held away from his body. "You have made a terrible mistake, Caroline," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You cannot kill me. You do not have it in you." "Perhaps not," Caroline agreed, "but I do not need to kill you. I just need you to leave and never come back." "And why would I do that?" "Because if you do not, I will tell everyone what you are. I will write letters to every newspaper in Denver, to your bank, to your business associates. I will detail every bruise, every broken bone, every threat, every moment of terror you inflicted on me. I will ruin you, Gerald, your reputation, your social standing, everything you value. It will all be destroyed." Gerald laughed, though there was an edge of desperation to it now. "No one will believe you. I am a respected businessman. You are a runaway wife living in sin. My word against yours." "Perhaps," Caroline said, "but people will talk. There will be scandal. Questions will be raised, and even if only half the people who hear the story believe it, that is enough to taint you. You will never be invited to the right parties, never close the important business deals, never be accepted by the society you have worked so hard to join. Your world will become very small, Gerald." She could see him calculating, weighing his options. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want a divorce, legal and final. You will file the papers citing abandonment or whatever legal grounds you choose. You will not contest it. You will not seek any financial settlement. You will simply let me go." "And if I refuse?" "Then I start writing those letters, and if that does not work, well," Caroline's voice hardened, "I have gotten very good with this rifle, Gerald. Accidents happen in the mountains all the time. A man could disappear up here and never be found. Think carefully about which outcome you prefer." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines. Finally, Gerald nodded stiffly. "Fine, you will have your divorce. But Caroline, if I ever see you again, if you ever come back to Denver, I will make you regret this." "I have no intention of ever seeing you again," Caroline said. "Now get on your horse and ride. And Gerald, if you come back here, if you ever threaten me or my family again, I will kill you. That is not a threat. It is a promise." Gerald mounted his horse without another word. Caroline kept the rifle trained on him until he had ridden out of sight, until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the night. Only then did she lower the weapon. Only then did she allow herself to shake, to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She stumbled back to the cabin, her legs weak, her entire body trembling with delayed reaction. She climbed through the back window, replaced the rifle by the door, and checked on Daniel. He was sleeping peacefully, undisturbed by the drama that had unfolded outside. Caroline sank into the rocking chair beside the cradle and let herself weep, great gulping sobs that shook her entire frame. She had faced Gerald, she had stood up to him, she had sent him away, and she had done it herself, without needing to be rescued, without needing Ezra to fight her battles. That was how Ezra found her when he returned an hour later, sitting in the rocking chair, tears streaming down her face, the rifle close at hand. He took one look at the scene, at Caroline's expression, at the open back window, and understood that something significant had happened. "Tell me," he said simply, kneeling beside the rocking chair and taking her hands in his. And Caroline told him everything: Gerald's arrival, the standoff, the trap he had set, her desperate plan to circle around and confront him. Ezra listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively more grim. When she finished, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If something had gone wrong, if he had shot you." "But he did not," Caroline said. "I was careful, Ezra, and I could not let him hurt you. I could not lose you." "You are the bravest person I have ever known," Ezra said. "Do you understand that? What you did tonight, facing your greatest fear, protecting our family, that took more courage than most people possess." "I was terrified the entire time," Caroline admitted. "Courage is not the absence of fear," Ezra said. "It is acting despite the fear, and you did that. You saved us, Caroline. You saved our family." Over the following weeks, as the shock of that night faded, Caroline found that something fundamental had shifted inside her. She no longer jumped at loud noises. She no longer flinched when doors closed. The hypervigilance that had been her constant companion for so long had eased. She was not healed completely. Healing was a journey, not a destination, but she was better, stronger, more whole. True to his word, Gerald filed for divorce. The papers arrived via courier in early spring, legal documents that formally ended Caroline's first marriage and freed her to fully embrace her second. She signed them without hesitation, feeling as though a weight she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Life in the mountains continued, the seasons turning in their endless cycle. Daniel grew from a toddler to a boy, strong and confident, taught by his father to respect the wilderness and by his mother to value gentleness and kindness. When he was 3, he was joined by a sister, a tiny girl with her mother's copper hair, whom they named Margaret. 2 years later came another son, Thomas, who seemed determined to keep up with his older brother from the moment he could crawl. Ezra proved to be as devoted a father to all 3 children as he was a husband to Caroline. He taught them to track and hunt, to read the weather and respect the land. But he also taught them tenderness, modeling in his interactions with Caroline and with them the kind of patient, unconditional love that made them feel safe and cherished. And through it all, Ezra maintained his vigilance over the small things that made their home a place of peace. Doors never slammed in the Blackwood household. Voices were never raised in anger. Conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than violence. Their children grew up knowing security and love, with no concept of the fear that had once dominated their mother's life. Caroline bloomed in this environment, growing from the frightened, wounded woman who had arrived in Silver Creek into someone confident and capable. She became known among the few neighbors they had in their remote area as someone who could handle any crisis, who could deliver a baby or set a broken bone or hunt for meat when Ezra was away. She was a survivor in the truest sense, someone who had endured hell and emerged not broken, but forged into something stronger than before. As the years passed and their children grew, Caroline and Ezra's love deepened into something that transcended mere romance. They were partners in the truest sense, each complementing the other, each making the other better. They had weathered storms both literal and figurative, had faced down demons both external and internal, and had emerged with their bond not just intact but strengthened. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ezra surprised Caroline by taking her to the same meadow where he had first proposed. It was summer again, the wildflowers in full bloom, the creek babbling cheerfully through the center. The children were spending the day with a neighboring family, giving Caroline and Ezra a rare day alone. They spread a blanket under the same pine tree where they had once shared lunch and dreams, and for a while they simply sat in comfortable silence, soaking in the peace of the moment. "Do you ever regret it?" Ezra asked finally. "Leaving civilization, living so remotely, tying yourself to a rough mountain man who can barely remember to comb his hair?" Caroline laughed and reached up to smooth said hair, which was as wild as ever despite her efforts. "Not for a single moment. You gave me something I had never thought to have, a home where I feel safe, a life where I can breathe, love without fear. How could I ever regret that?" "I was terrified when I first met you," Ezra admitted. "Terrified that I would not be enough, that I would fail you somehow, that I could not heal what had been broken." "You did not need to heal me," Caroline said gently. "You just needed to give me a safe place to heal myself. And you did that. You gave me space and time and patience and love, and that was everything I needed." Ezra kissed her then, soft and lingering, a kiss that spoke of a decade of shared history, of trials overcome, of love tested and proven true. When they pulled apart, Caroline was smiling, her eyes bright with happiness. "We should get back," she said eventually, though neither of them made any move to stand. "The children will be terrorizing the neighbors by now." "Let them terrorize a little longer," Ezra said, pulling her close. "I want to stay here with you just like this for a little while more." And so they did. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a family in the wild places where civilization barely reached. They stayed in that meadow until the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold, a fitting backdrop for the kind of enduring love that stories are made of. As they finally packed up to head home, Caroline paused and looked back at the meadow, committing the moment to memory. This place had witnessed the beginning of their journey together, the moment when she had decided to trust again, to hope again, to love again. And now, a decade later, it bore witness to the strength of what they had built. "I love you, Ezra Blackwood," she said. "I love you, Caroline Blackwood," Ezra replied, "today, tomorrow, and for all the days after." They walked back to their cabin hand in hand, ready to reclaim their children and return to the beautiful, hard, rewarding life they had created together. And when they arrived home and Daniel came running to meet them, followed by Margaret and Thomas, their laughter echoing through the pines, Caroline knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice all those years ago. She had found her home, she had found her family, she had found herself, and she had done it all because one mountain man had noticed that she flinched when doors slammed and had decided to make sure that no door ever slammed near her again. In the years that followed, the Blackwood family continued to thrive in their mountain sanctuary. Daniel grew into a young man who combined his father's strength with his mother's intelligence, eventually deciding to become a doctor so he could help the scattered families who lived in the remote regions of Montana Territory. Margaret showed an early aptitude for teaching and announced her intention to establish a school for the children of trappers and miners who otherwise had no access to education. Thomas, the youngest, proved to have his father's affinity for the wilderness and his mother's gentle heart, declaring that he would be a mountain man like his father, but would also help wounded animals whenever he could. Caroline and Ezra watched their children grow and flourish with pride and joy, knowing that the legacy they were leaving was one of love, resilience, and the absolute conviction that home was not a place, but a feeling of safety, of acceptance, of being cherished exactly as you are. On quiet evenings, when the children were settled and the cabin was peaceful, Caroline would sometimes sit on the porch with Ezra, watching the sunset over the mountains that had become her refuge and her fortress. She no longer thought about Gerald, no longer woke from nightmares of her past. Those memories had faded like old scars, visible if you looked for them, but no longer painful, no longer defining. "What are you thinking about?" Ezra would ask, his arm warm around her shoulders. "How far I have come," Caroline would reply, "how much I have to be grateful for." And it was true. From the terrified woman who had flinched at every sudden sound to the confident, capable mother and wife she had become, Caroline's journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it, every painful step, because it had led her here, to this man, to this family, to this life, where doors closed gently and love was given freely, and fear had no power. The mountain man who had noticed her flinch all those years ago in Silver Creek had kept his promise. He had made sure that no door ever slammed near her, that no voice was ever raised in anger, that their home remained a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. But more than that, he had given her the space and the support to reclaim her own strength, to remember that she was not a victim, but a survivor, not broken, but beautifully, courageously whole. And in return, Caroline had given Ezra something he had not known he needed: a family, a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to come down from the mountains and rejoin the human race. She had softened his rough edges without diminishing his strength, had brought warmth and light to his isolated existence, had shown him that the walls he had built around his heart were not necessary, that it was safe to love and be loved in return. Together, they had built something extraordinary, a marriage based not on convention or convenience, but on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the kind of deep, abiding love that could weather any storm. They had created a home where their children could grow up secure and confident, where kindness was valued above all else, where the mistakes of the past were acknowledged but not allowed to define the future. As Caroline sat on that porch, wrapped in her husband's arms, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, she thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in Silver Creek, afraid, alone, convinced that she would never know peace or happiness again. She thought about how wrong she had been, how much life had still had to offer if only she had been brave enough to reach for it. And she thought about the man beside her, the mountain man with the gentle hands and the fierce protective instincts, who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen not to take advantage but to shelter, not to control but to support, not to demand but to give. "Thank you," she whispered into the growing darkness. "For what?" Ezra asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. "For noticing," Caroline said, "for caring, for making sure no door ever slammed near me, for giving me time to heal, for loving me even when I could not love myself. For all of it." Ezra pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You never have to thank me for loving you, Caroline. It is the greatest privilege of my life." And as they sat there together, two souls who had found each other in the vast wilderness of the Montana Territory, who had built a life of purpose and meaning against all odds, the mountains stood silent witness to their happiness. The same mountains that had sheltered them, challenged them, and ultimately brought them together, now watched over them and their children, steadfast and eternal, a fitting monument to a love that had overcome fear, transcended pain, and proven that even the most wounded heart could learn to trust again. In the end, theirs was a story not of rescue, but of partnership, not of a woman saved by a man, but of two damaged souls who had saved each other. It was a story of choosing courage over fear, hope over despair, love over all the reasons not to love. It was a story that began with a flinch and a slammed door, but ended with peace, with joy, with a family gathered around a table in a mountain cabin, sharing a meal in their lives and the comfortable certainty that they were home. And every night, when the children were in bed and the fire was banked and Caroline and Ezra lay together in the darkness, the cabin door closed with a gentle click, soft as a whisper, silent as a promise kept. No door would ever slam near Caroline Blackwood again. Her mountain man had made sure of it. And in doing so, he had given her not just a home, but a future, not just protection, but freedom, not just his love, but the space to reclaim her own strength and become the remarkable woman she was always meant to be. Years rolled by, each one adding to the tapestry of their shared life. Their children married and had children of their own, extending the Blackwood legacy into a new generation. Daniel established a medical practice that served the scattered communities throughout the Bitterroot Range, riding circuit like the preachers of old to bring healing to those who needed it. Margaret opened her school, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic to children who might otherwise have grown up illiterate. Thomas took over Ezra's trap lines, managing them with the same respect for the land and the animals that his father had taught him. And through it all, Caroline and Ezra remained the center, the foundation upon which their family was built. They aged gracefully together, their hair turning silver, their faces weathering like the mountains around them, but their love remaining as vital and present as it had been on the day they first met. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had gathered at the cabin for the celebration, Ezra stood and raised his glass. "To my wife," he said, his voice still strong despite his years, "who taught me that strength comes in many forms, that healing is a journey worth taking, and that love is always worth the risk. Carolyn, you are my heart, my home, my everything. Here is to 30 more years." 30 more years, the family echoed, glasses raised, faces smiling. Carolyn looked around at the people gathered in their cabin, this space that had once held just two wounded souls but now overflowed with life and love and laughter, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. She had survived, she had healed, she had thrived. And she had done it all because she had been brave enough to trust one more time, to believe one more time, to love one more time. The mountain man who had noticed her flinch had given her the world, and in return, she had given him her heart, her trust, her future. It was a fair trade, she thought, the best trade either of them had ever made. As the celebration continued around them, Caroline caught Ezra's eye across the room. He smiled at her, that same slow, warm smile that had first made her think that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy again. She smiled back, and in that moment, no words were necessary. Everything that needed to be said was there in the look they shared, in the life they had built, in the family that surrounded them. This was home. This was love. This was everything she had never dared to hope for when she had fled Denver all those years ago, terrified and alone. And it had all begun because one good man had noticed that she flinched when a door slammed and had decided to do something about it. That simple act of kindness, that small gesture of caring, had changed everything. It had set in motion a chain of events that led to healing, to love, to a life beyond anything either of them could have imagined. And as Caroline stood there in the cabin surrounded by the fruits of that choice, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected kindness, for mountain men with gentle souls, and for the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The door to the cabin stood open to let in the summer breeze, and when someone finally closed it hours later as the party wound down, it made no sound at all. Just a gentle settling into place, as soft as a sigh, as quiet as contentment, the way all doors should close, the way all love should feel, safe, secure, and surrounded by the absolute certainty that you are exactly where you belong.